New York, New York, all the burning Empire State political questions and answers in just a few New York minutes. Now, from the left, Richard Brodsky, former New York Assemblyman, senior fellow at Demos and professor at NYU. And to the right, John Cahill, Governor Pataki's former chief of staff, former commissioner of New York State's Department of Environmental Conservation. 3 questions, guys, 2 minutes for each. Let's get into question number 1, and it has to do with your old stomping grounds in Albany. Obviously, a spate of corruption that's faced it, a lot of different ideas on how to fix it. First off, just how bad is the problem and what is the remedy?
It's bad, and it can't be ignored or apologized for or shrugged away, but it can't be overemphasized. The legislative process in Albany and the executive process remains uncorrupt. There are corrupt people in it, but the process that decides things about taxes and schools, that's still working. We've got to find a way to fix it without claiming that the whole system is corrupt.
Oh, Richard and I agree on something. It is a real problem in Albany. But I think one of the issues that really has to be focused on is the role of the legislature in the corruption, because certainly no one in Albany is beyond corruption, but it's clearly the focal point has been on legislators. And they are simply not held to the same level as accountability as the executive. They're not subject to the Freedom of Information Law. They have outside income. They've been funding local community groups, not-for-profits, and that is the root cause of
in the
corruption
legislature.
in Albany.
The root cause of corruption are contracts let by the executive branch. The one out of the last 3 governors has resigned in disgrace. Only about 5% of the legislature.
They haven't resigned over corruption. They were resigned over issues other than political corruption.
How about the controller?
How about name me one person in the last 2-3 years in these lineup of Albany people that are not legislators? They are not held to the same level of accountability. Why aren't they subject to FOIL? Why are they allowed all this outside income? Why are they allowed to fund local community groups?
Let me ask that, guys. The idea that, and Jeannie Zano, a guest this week, brought it up, pay him more, but not let him have a second job.
That's fine. Their second jobs have never been shown to be the cause of the corruption. The guys who are stealing in other areas other than their outside employment activities.
Oh,
look,
they're stealing their funding. Instead of taking it directly from Albany, they're funding a not-for-profit, and they're putting their sisters, their brothers, and everybody else on the dole.
He stumbled on the truth, but that has nothing to do with outside income. The attempt to focus this on the legislature is an attempt to weaken the legislative oversight of the executive branch. This is bad stuff.
That's nonsense.
It can't be shrugged off.
The legislature should be held to the same level of accountability as the executive. Why aren't they subject to the Freedom of Information Law? Why? There's no rational reason
on that one
for
you're right, but the notion that the group that's overseeing the legislature has to be weakened is at the heart of what you're talking about.
They monitor themselves. There's no independent oversight, and it's shown that they can't be trusted.
Seeing that we have consensus, let's move on to number 2 here. We don't have a decision yet from the Cuomo administration when it comes to hydrofracking. Now, one of the key administration officials says there's, quote, no timeline for a decision on the issue. Guys, hydrofracking, good or bad for New York? I'll start with you.
You know, I think hydrofracking provides a real economic and environmental opportunity for our country and for our state. The fact of the matter is that the rest of the country has moved forward in hydrofracking, and yes, there are going to be local and environmental concerns. But as former commissioner of DEC, I have every confidence that if you put in the right regulatory process and the right funding, our state regulators can ensure the safety of both the public and the environment. The fact that we are the only state in the country that is not developing this important resource for both economic growth and, yes, the environmental benefits associated with developing an economy based upon natural gas as opposed to coal or oil, it's transformational. It's transformational here in New York, and it's transformational internationally.
With all due respect, you put makeup on a pig, it's still a pig. The fact of the matter is that if John is wrong about the environmental calculations, this isn't an oops that you can clean up with a mop. This is a fundamental destruction of our water supplies. This is not something that you can do based on trusting the companies or even trusting a man who is most of the time trustworthy.
I don't say trust. I'm not saying we should trust anybody. I'm saying we should put in the appropriate regulatory oversight with appropriate funding to make sure that they do it the right way, especially these smaller mom and pops.
Should they be required to disclose the chemicals they put in the ground? Well, New York isn't asking for that yet.
Well, they should. I mean, listen, the issue of full disclosure and full transparency absolutely should be part of any regulatory process. They should not be doing things that are not fully disclosed to the regulators and the public.
Is it worth the risk? Because there's no guarantees. Is it worth the risk if you know all the chemicals they're using then, Richard?
Right now, we're so far from that outcome that it's hard to answer. We don't have that transparency, and the risks are enormous. It's almost like the Gulf of Mexico thing come back. You're wrong once, and it's in the billions and billions and billions of dollars of damage. That kind of risks need to be much more carefully handled.
The benefits are enormous. Yes, there are certain risks, but there are risks in every industrial process that we engage in right now. And that doesn't mean we say no to them. We look to manage and mitigate the risks to the fullest extent possible. Why aren't we doing that with hydrofracking? Why aren't we absolutely mitigating the risk, but capitalizing on the economic benefits?
The first time Richard acknowledges the bell. All right, let's get to question 3. Mayoral race, and depending on the day, somebody's up, somebody's down here. A good friend, Dominic Carter, a very revealing interview with Anthony Weiner. Who at this point, it looks like Joe Loder is going to emerge on the Republican side, but on the Democratic side, and I'll start with you, Richard, whose stock are you buying and selling at this point?
Don't underestimate Weiner. He's smart, he's tough, he's well funded, and he's going to ask for forgiveness, and American people kind of like that. Chris Quinn has the only one so far who's emerged as a credible, moving, improving candidate. So in the end, I think it's going to come down to them. But you got Billy Thompson, who has an ethnic base and has experience as the head of the school board and as controller. De Blasio's not chopped liver either. It's all up in the air.
As a Republican, it's kind of fun watching the Democrats kind of implode over one another. But I think, obviously Billy Thompson, I think he hasn't been fully engaged yet in the campaign. Once he does, I think he's going to be a tough candidate to beat. On the Republican side, I think Joe Loder is the one candidate in the race that will keep the city moving forward. I mean, you look at 20 years of governance in New York City, basically by Republicans, by both Giuliani and Bloomberg, and has been transformational for New York City. The idea that New York City...
He's really wrapped his arms around the Giuliani years. Is that going to be a problem?
Well, he hasn't. I mean, he's wrapped his arms around the things that he did within the Giuliani administration that were transformative.
Oh, please.
There are going to be issues, but this at the end of the day is going to be based on Joe Loder.
Giuliani's wrapped his arms around Loder in ways that hurt him, to the extent that there have been editorials saying the last thing Loder needs is to be the next Giuliani.
Well, Joe is a big man. He can make his own decisions. He's not going to rely on Giuliani. The formation of his policies for the city
as much
is
as you
what's
want
to
to say that is true, he has to establish that.
He has.
Rich, on so far for Democrats, though, there's been a point that there's a circular firing squad at this point. It's normal for a primary.
It's not
but there's one point. Is the target, the conservative target by all the guys in the field against Christine Quinn just because she's a front runner or something else?
It's just because she's a front runner. It would be the same for anybody else. She earned her way up to being the front runner. They're going to have to earn their way up to matching her. She's run a good, solid campaign. This isn't a circular firing squad. This is an election. And in an election, there will be ups and downs. People will make mistakes. There's the bell, John. You can't do this.
Out of time here. Thanks, guys, for playing. Next week, our next installment of New York, New York.